When NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stood before reporters in London last week, his words marked a seismic shift in how the West views Russia's war machine. According to him, Vladimir Putin's Russia is running out of money, troops, and ideas. This was more than just geopolitics or optimism talking, but a one-line assessment of the slow but steady decline in Russia's military and geopolitical power. At the start of the war, Russia had the manpower, the resources, and the industrial capacity to plow through Ukraine. And even though those initial strategies turned out to be non-starters, Russia was considered to be the de facto winner of the war of attrition that the conflict seemingly devolved into as 2023 rolled in. But now, NATO is not so sure about that assessment, as battlefield reports are streaming in information about increasingly desperate measures from Russia, which point to the war in Ukraine slowly devouring Russia from within. The key supportive evidence for this has been pure battlefield wins that Ukraine has managed to eke out over the past few months. Notably, Russian forces had failed to take over the city of Pokrovsk for yet another year, being forced back several miles out of the city's boundaries, where they could then be pummeled by artillery fire. This key logistical hub in eastern Donbass, which Moscow has spent months trying to capture in a bloody assault, became the symbol of Russia's summer of failure. In mid-September 2025, The Telegraph reported that Russian units made up of soldiers infected with HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases had been spotted around Pokrovsk. Let that sink in for a moment. Putin's military has formed up units composed of soldiers infected with potentially deadly diseases and has sent them into battle. These soldiers wear armbands identifying them as carrying life-threatening diseases, a desperate attempt to create a moral and psychological pressure on Ukrainian defenders. Dmytro Zhmylo, executive director of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center, confirmed that these units are participating in fighting in what is currently the hottest spot of Pokrovsk. If this is what Moscow feels compelled to do to sustain its operational tempo, then the military is literally and figuratively running on empty. The situation around Pokrovsk tells the broader story of Russia's summer offensive. Roughly 16,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the area around the city alone since late August. Despite throwing massive forces at the city, Russian forces are making gains that are significant but likely do not portend the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in the area. Even when Russian forces managed limited penetrations, with several small Russian infantry units totaling some 200 soldiers evading defensive lines and established positions inside Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces have reportedly held defensive lines and inflicted significant losses on the Russians. Meanwhile, Ukraine demonstrated that it wasn't simply playing defense, as various reports of villages being recovered from Russia's control streamed through media channels throughout August. And in October, Ukraine fully struck back, with the 141st Mechanized Brigade carrying out successful assaults across the region. In total, it's estimated that Ukraine has managed to seize back control of roughly 24 villages. While the actual territorial gains aren't much to write home about, the principle is what matters, with Ukraine proving that it won't abandon this vital city and that it still has a few tricks up its sleeves to punish reckless Russian offensives. But while Pokrovsk accounts for much of Russia's current woes, as some reports suggest that around 40% of all fighting is happening there, the actual source is far away from Ukraine itself. It could be argued that the Russian failures inevitably stem from a military doctrine that was fundamentally unsuitable for modern warfare and interlocked geopolitical and economic ties. The problem begins with how Russia thinks about war itself. Putin's invasion wasn't actually planned by Russia's military command, but by the FSB, Russia's security services. Putin expected to take control of Ukraine within 10 days. Instead of a conventional invasion led by the entire military force Russia could muster, Putin planned what he termed a special military operation led by the Russian security services. As a result, Moscow has been shown via parades packed for victory celebrations practically before the operation began, all to showcase to the world how confident Russia was in its military and even geopolitical reach. But what didn't make it out of the country was spare parts for extended combat operations. Even more damning, captured maps from Russian mid-level commanders did not contain a decision to attack. Instead, there was a dubious decision to march in the absence of the threat of encountering the enemy. The reason for this was twofold. One, FSB falsely assumed that Ukraine's history of corruption and dissent for the government would carry over into Zelensky's term. With Ukraine flip-flopping between aligning itself with Russia in the West, some FSB officers compiled a report where a lot of Ukraine would simply welcome Russian officers and military with open arms. In that sense, Russia could use the same strategy as it did when it annexed Crimea over a decade ago. As we know now, however, Russia failed to realize the level of resentment that came from the annexation and the subsequent cold conflict. Secondly, Russia's previous large-scale conflict was fought way back in the 1980s, when the country was practically the leader of the Second World and still had the Soviet regime to back up its industry and military preparedness. After the dissolution of the Union, Russia's success in Georgia in 2008, in a protracted conflict with minimal troop requirements, led to the total dismantlement of countrywide mobilization efforts and supply channels. IFRI suggested that this ultimately caused Russian strategy to rely on wishful strategic thinking that is now obvious in hindsight when looking at the first few months of the war. So when reality hit, Russia had no contingency plans. The clearest example came at Hostomel Airport, just a few miles out of Kyiv proper. This operation was supposed to be Russia's only large-scale operation in Ukraine. The plan was to seize the airport, airlift reinforcements directly into Ukraine's capital region, and march on Kyiv before Ukraine could react. Instead, it quickly devolved into a disaster. Russia sent a forward force of between 200 and 300 special operations personnel aboard 34 helicopters from Belarus. On the Ukrainian side, around 200 conscripts from Ukraine's 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade were based on the airfield and had established defensive positions, armed with small arms, Soviet-era anti-aircraft missiles, and anti-tank weapons. Ukrainian defenders managed to shoot down 4 Ka-52 helicopters and an Mi-28, significantly disrupting the Russian assault and giving them a much-needed morale boost to see things through. Even more importantly, Ukraine had an inkling about the strategy, filling the airstrip with vehicles and downed aircraft, making it useless for landing reinforcements. So at the first sign of actual resistance, Russia abandoned all further plans. 18 Il-76 transport planes loaded with around 1,000 troops were spotted moving from Pskov, but none of the reinforcements would show up at the airport, likely being rerouted back to Russia or Belarus. This tactical failure revealed deep structural problems in how Russia thought about war. Russia's military suffers from a generational issue caused by its Soviet roots, combined with a deep resistance to external paradigms and adapting the doctrine to modern times and equipment capabilities. Unlike NATO forces, which institutionalize battlefield lessons, Russia defaults to predetermined scenarios and attritional warfare, recycling past models and relying on predictable mass mobilization over maneuver. There's chronic underdevelopment of Russia's non-commissioned officer corps, creating weak links between the higher officers, creating tactics, and the troops on the front, preventing them from fulfilling them. Additionally, Russia's defaults for the war assumed a terrain advantage in a defensive war against NATO, where it would use a combination of mechanized infantry and aerial support to deny air superiority and attrition the enemy on its own terms. Russia's rigid top-down command structure also left lower-level officers unable to make autonomous tactical decisions. This makes Russian operations inflexible by default, which means that once things start going wrong, Russian tactics have no way to compensate for sudden changes. So when Russia mounted an offensive war in Ukraine, it did so without managing to secure air superiority, since it didn't have the military and training structure to do so in the first place. The layered defenses provided by Ukraine then meant that most of Russia's air force would end up being underutilized until the development and proliferation of glide bombs in 2024. Meanwhile, Ukraine had been training with NATO forces since 2014, gaining years of experience in adaptive small-scale operations. When Russian units encountered unexpected resistance or changing battlefield conditions, they simply couldn't adapt. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, could improvise, innovate, and exploit Russia's predictability. But there's another, more insidious problem at play. Putin has spent 20 years systematically destroying any possibility of receiving accurate information or dissenting options. Putin truly believed Ukraine wasn't legitimate or independent without Russia. This was broadcast in his famous essay on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians in July 2021, practically heralding the invasion. But more critically, for the past 20 years, Putin has done his best to dismantle any dissenting opinions from both his inner circle and his government. He is surrounded by people who either have the same ideological view as him or are so afraid of contradicting him that they don't show it. This created a catastrophic intelligence failure. Russian intelligence was providing assessments that were practically flights of fancy. The gathered data by the FSB was carefully filtered to create a picture that supported Putin's beliefs, namely that he was pushing on an open door in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Western intelligence knew exactly what Russia was planning. In November 2021, CIA Director William Burns traveled to Moscow to directly warn Russian officials against invading. In mid-January 2022, Burns visited Kyiv to personally brief Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on US intelligence assessments of Russia's imminent invasion. This intelligence sharing gave Ukraine a crucial advantage. Ukraine knew about the Hostomel airport assault. Ukrainian forces were prepared and waiting. Russian intelligence, by contrast, told Putin what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Putin's echo chamber creates a structural problem that goes beyond bad battlefield intelligence. Without opposition, Russia is forced to execute orders that are against its long-term interests. Russia could have probably backed out earlier and avoided the economic catastrophe that was coming, but admitting failure would require admitting the initial assessment was wrong, something Putin's system cannot tolerate. This creates dangerous instability within the Russian government itself. Putin's regime rests on perhaps just a few hundred key people in the security services, military command, and oligarchy. Currently, Putin's entire regime has such a stranglehold on these people that they have everything to lose and nothing to gain by trying to work against him. But if these people start fearing for their own safety or long-term prospects as the war drags on and economic conditions deteriorate, the entire structure could fracture. The regime that eliminated dissent to maintain control might find the same lack of dissent prevents the adaptation necessary for survival. And when that happens, those same people could start believing that Putin is no longer working in their interests, regardless of what that does to the country as a whole. Then, we could see Putin ousted or replaced by someone who can take the country in a different direction, or at least present a different face for Western politics to latch onto. This regime change could stem from Russia's economy being practically strangled by the war effort itself. For one, Russia's defense spending for 2025 is expected to exceed 8% of GDP and account for 40% of total federal expenditure, a record not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War era and only matched by Ukraine, which is receiving multi-billion-dollar donations from NATO. This is a significant expansion from pre-war figures of around 22% of the government's budget going to the military. Russia has managed to do this with reforms and tax increases meant to sustain the economy throughout the war, but these are short-term efforts that have already started to show cracks. For one, Russia's oil and gas industry has stopped being such a prevalent contributor to the country's economy. The industry accounted for up to 50% of the revenue in the years before the war, and even up to 2024 as Russia funneled funding to evade sanctions and diversify exports. But that trade has now stagnated, with China and India commanding much lower prices for importing Russian crude, while also creating a practical duopoly on legal exports out of Russia. To bypass this, Russia has used its shadow fleet to transport oil through tankers to third parties, even including some European nations. However, the countries that do buy Russian shadow fleet oil have gone increasingly under scrutiny for doing so. EU members that have access to the Baltic, which holds major oil export ports for Russia, have started sanctioning more and more vessels and preventing Russia from using them in the fleet. At the same time, the EU imposing limits on Russian oil prices region-wide could lead to yet another dip in revenue. Secondly, Russia's military-industrial sector has turned almost entirely to fueling the war effort itself. A report by the Jamestown Foundation suggests a drop of 92% in arms exports between 2021 and 2024. That's removed practically all revenue that Russia was expecting from selling weaponry to allies like Iran, Syria, or India. Meanwhile, Russia has enacted domestic reforms that are indicative of imminent collapse. The country raised the tax on companies and incomes in 2024. In 2025, it will look into additionally raising the VAT on goods and services. The new plan for 2026 includes further increasing the tax on personal and corporate income, adding more tax brackets, and lowering the revenue threshold for companies needing to pay tax, significantly increasing the potential influx of money from its own citizens. While these all sound well on paper, the result is that people will be taxed more while also having fewer jobs all around, as the Russian military-industrial complex and recruitment drive are funneling more and more of taxpayer money into higher salaries and putting other industries out of business. And even then, the military complex is under increasing pressure from the state, since many contractors are forced to accept contracts at below-market rates or face criminal charges for failing to meet unreasonable demands. Putin has therefore effectively created an economic model that can only survive through continued warfare. Peace would expose just how severe Russia's economic and demographic problems are and force the government to confront the massive social problems it's created. But even these efforts are not working. Russia's ballooning economy has forced Putin to accept that he'd need to reduce military spending, with the most recent estimate being a reduction of around $6.3 billion in the 2026 budget compared to 2025. This doesn't account for the potential for inflation to make the problem worse. While Russia's war machine grinds down, Europe has emerged as the backbone of Ukrainian resistance in ways that threaten to permanently reshape the geopolitical landscape. The coalition of the willing is the first such fundamental shift in European security policy. Proposed by France and the United Kingdom in February 2025, the coalition currently contains 33 countries, with the US being one of the major absentees from the list. More particularly, the coalition stemmed from the US increasingly becoming disengaged with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially after Trump's second term started at the beginning of 2025. In July, the coalition reaffirmed its agreement to provide at least €40 billion in military support to Ukraine in 2025, matching the commitment made by the NATO alliance in 2024. A primary priority for support is the strengthening of Ukraine's air defense capabilities, with leaders agreeing for further support to deter massive Russian drone attacks and to increase financing for the production of drone interceptors. The coalition has become more of a funding mechanism. In the October meeting, the coalition members agreed to ramp up sanctions on Russia, forcing it to pay reparations and even directly increase the military pressure on Russia and ensure Ukraine's security after the war is ended. Perhaps most significantly, Europe is breaking its historical dependence on Russian energy. For decades, Russian gas and oil gave Moscow leverage over European policy. Some countries have even spent more on importing Russian oil throughout the war than they sent in donations to Ukraine. That leverage is evaporating. With each new sanction, that economic lifeline from the West is slowly being strangled to death, while support for Ukraine is increasing. Individual European nations are also making substantial commitments both to Ukraine and the coalition itself. France and the UK have been discussing expanding their nuclear deterrence to cover the rest of Europe, freeing American missiles from their stockpiles across the continent and making it less dependent on US policy. Germany has agreed to increase military spending and investment up to 5% of GDP, with roughly 1.5% used for creating and maintaining infrastructure. Romania and Denmark have created separate plans to directly support Ukraine's military procurement, the first by purchasing drones for both Romania and Ukraine, and the second by allowing Ukraine to build military factories inside Denmark. This European solidarity is precisely what Putin gambled wouldn't happen. His invasion was premised on the belief that Europe would fragment, with energy dependence trumping security concerns and moral obligations. Instead, the EU is now seriously starting to consider building a standing army that is on par with the US itself in terms of spending and military preparedness. And even if Russia somehow prevails militarily, the victory will be Pyrrhic to the point of being indistinguishable from defeat. The human cost of the war has been staggering. Western analyses suggest well over 1 million total casualties in the war itself, counting both severe injuries and deaths. But those casualties have an even greater effect on the domestic culture in Russia, as soldiers return home battered and broken from what they saw or did in the war. According to the Kremlin itself, by June 2025, almost 140,000 Russian soldiers will have returned to civilian life after fighting in the war against Ukraine in mid-2025. Many of these veterans are expected to suffer from PTSD and exhibit violent tendencies. By March 2025, veterans have killed and maimed more than 750 people inside Russia, with most common victims being relatives and friends. Russia's defense ministry has estimated that 1 in 5 war veterans suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, and more people have permanently left the army through other means. According to an investigation by Front Intelligence, at least 50,000 Russian soldiers had deserted by May 2025, with the company expecting a total of 70,000 desertions by the end of the year. Some Russian deserters have resorted to getting locked up, creating criminal cases that would result in sentences precluding them from ever serving in the military. At least then, Ukrainian holding prisons for prisoners of war have been considered to have much more favorable conditions than Russian ones. This represents the ultimate failure of military morale, when soldiers would rather surrender to the enemy than continue serving their own country. The economic devastation extends far beyond wartime spending. Russian authorities claim that just over half of the returning soldiers have found employment. Most of those jobs are in security or manual labor, paying just 40 to 60,000 rubles a month. Compare this to the inflated military salaries of over 150,000 rubles per month that were being promised left and right during the war. They simply won't be able to adjust and are more likely to re-enlist to get the higher salary, signing bonus, or injury compensation. The government has essentially created a military caste that can only maintain its standard of living through continued warfare. This is the death spiral that Putin has created. The war economy creates dependency on military service, where industries are slowly being shut down through internal competition and external sanctions. The only solution is more war, more recruitment, more economic militarization. Each turn of this spiral tightens the noose around Russia's future. The result could very well be the end of Putin's regime and even the Russian Federation as a whole. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn how Ukraine plans to defeat Russia, check out this video. And to stay up to date with the most recent breakthroughs in the war, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos. And thank you as always for watching.